subject of this lecture is fluid intelligence. For creative types, fluid intelligence for the brain is like a fine red wine at dinner. Relaxing, delicious, intoxicating. It's the second of the two great ingredients Ray Cattell and John Horn believe comprise general human intelligence. To introduce you to the fluid intelligence world, I would like first to introduce you to a scientist, Anke Damaske. In a minute, I'm going to ask her a question, but first I wonder if you'd like to take a shot at it. If I said to you the words sour milk, then asked you to list the first words that came to mind, what would you say? I'm guessing your first response would probably not be designer fabric. If someone said the words designer fabric in your hearing, you might either think they were crazy or, after listening to this lecture, speculate that they routinely score high on cognitive creativity tests. But the response designer fabric would not be so strange to Anke Damaske. If I said the word sour milk to Anke, then asked her what came to mind, her very first response would probably be designer fabric. Why? Because she has found a way to take the sour milk that people normally throw out and turn the stuff into designer fabrics. And to do so in an environmentally responsible way, this enterprise has become her life's work. Would you call her creative? I certainly would. How she came up with such an innovative idea illustrates nicely the subject of this lecture, fluid intelligence. To talk about this, I'm going to divide this lecture into three parts. First, I will speak in general terms about fluid intelligence. Second, I will discuss creativity, a topic which evolutionarily really separates us from our terrestrial colleagues in the light of this definition. And then finally, thirdly, I will explain the concept of working memory, an important ingredient in our modern understanding of fluid intelligence. The practical application will include an exercise which may be a real friend to boosting your creative output. Here's how one textbook defines fluid intelligence: the ability to deal with novel problem-solving situations for which personal experience does not supply a solution. That's a pretty broad definition. It's probably made clearer by describing what it does not include. Crystallized intelligence hinges on remembering prior experiences. That's why we talked about long-term memory. Long-term memory is the province of prior knowledge. Fluid intelligence does not rely on experience. It relies on things like inductive reasoning and abstract reasoning and pattern matching. It deeply engages your ability to come up with unique solutions when presented with vexing stimuli. This is not the realm of experience dependence. That's why the definition includes problem-solving skills. From an evolutionary perspective, we think these talents spring directly from the geological and meteorological instability of our East African birthplace. If we couldn't problem solve on the spot, if we didn't have robust fluid intelligence abilities, given our biological wimpiness, we'd be dead. Many brain teasers actually exercise fluid intelligence. If you're good at them, you may have strong fluid intelligence scores. Let me give you an example. The four walls of a house all face south. How is this possible? Did you find the answer? If you did, and Cattell and Horn were watching, they would probably say you're using your fluid intelligence skills. For those of you whose fluid intelligence skills are just kind of waking up, the correct answer is the house is located at the North Pole. Inductive reasoning, problem solving, pattern matching. All these skills sound a lot like they engage the more creative aspects of our psychological selves. Exactly what does creativity mean under these conditions? How does it relate to fluid intelligence? It is to these questions that we turn next. I do believe there is a relationship between fluid intelligence and creativity. They may actually intersect at a memory system and may even be two sides of the same coin. Explaining all of this is going to require some work. To understand the relationship between fluid intelligence and creativity, we will start by once again defining our terms, then characterizing the behavior. In part 2, which is coming next, that is exactly what we'll do. To the best of my knowledge, creativity has never been videotaped. That hardly makes it invisible, of course. Anybody with a pulse can tell the difference between two sentences like, "She drank her coffee," and "She heated her brain with an extra hot Americano." Is there anything in the peer-reviewed literature that can help us characterize these differences? There might very well be. Creativity may involve a balance between two cognitions on opposite sides of a catwalk. On one side, we have something called cognitive disinhibition. On the other side, we have something called latent inhibition. We'll define both, beginning with cognitive disinhibition. Noted Harvard psychologist Shelley Carson defines cognitive disinhibition as the failure to disregard information that is irrelevant to some pre-established goal or thought process or activity. Simply put, you choose not to remove extraneous facts from your conscious awareness, even if those facts are irrelevant to whatever goal you're trying to achieve. That's why it's called disinhibition. One way to illustrate cognitive disinhibition is to find new uses for something. Laboratory instruments have been devised that can measure it, instruments called tests of divergent thinking. One famous example involves finding new uses for a brick. Can you do it? Can you find new uses for a brick? If you're not particularly creative, you might respond by saying, "Oh, sure I can. Maybe it could be a paperweight. Maybe it could be a doorstop." None of those responses is very far away from a brick's typical job description, a heavy weight providing some support function. If you gave similar responses under testing conditions, your scores would actually be pretty low. If you are a particularly creative person, you are not tethered to the function of the brick. You are cognitively disinhibited, if you will. Here's one famous response that is a great example of someone who scores high on divergent thinking tests. "I would take sandpaper and a glass of water. I would scrape the brick with the sandpaper and allow the dust to mix with the water. Then I would use the concoction to paint something." Paint is about as far away from the typical structural use of a brick as I can think of. This is a very disinhibited response. Are all disinhibited responses signs of creativity? The answer, unfortunately, is no. For some people, cognitive disinhibition is a weapon of mass distraction. It results in the collapse of something we call cognitive filtering, which itself has many complex neurological processes associated with it. People who have unrestrained or unrestrainable cognitive disinhibition often have a mental health issue. This is an actual sentence from a man who suffers from schizophrenia. The quote is part of his clinical profile, and I use it as an example. Quote, "I am here from a foreign university, and you have to have a paucity, yes, paucity, a paucity of all acts of amendment to go through for the children's code, and it is no mental disturbance or putinance. It is an Amoritian law. It is like their privatalia." If you did not understand this paragraph fully, then you are hearing it correctly. We call this tossed jumble of thoughts word salad, a verbal pile of greens characteristic of many kinds of thought disorders, including schizophrenia. There isn't a lot to make sense of in this patient's quote, except perhaps a view of his intellect. The person appears to be unshackled, disinhibited, and also unintelligible. At 4 points, he actually makes up words that do not exist in the English language. That's uninhibited with a bullet. Unfortunately, it renders him highly dysfunctional. Were he to function creatively in a functioning real-world setting, he would need some kind of filtering system. What he is lacking, researchers believe, is something called latent inhibition. Put simply, latent inhibition is the ability to block out options in pursuit of some goal, like communicating with someone. It is a filtering system, and we use it all the time. It can even be measured in the laboratory. Let me give an example. Let's say I utter the word fountain, then ask you to shout out the first thing that comes to mind. Does the word water pop into your mouth? Perhaps. How about splash? Maybe. If you're an art major, you might even say Marcel Duchamp, are words that go with the cue fountain. Did the words Princess Diana's wedding dress come into your thinking? How about battle axe? Do the words meatloaf or measuring tape come to mind when I say fountain? Probably not. If you have a typically functioning internal filtering system, wedding dress, battle axe, and measuring tape are irrelevant, maybe even incongruous choices. Even if battle axe was coaxed into your awareness by the word fountain, you might be embarrassed to volunteer the word. Battle axe loses the competition in favor of water, splash, or Duchamp. This is an example of latent inhibition. We say you have inhibited the military choice, as well as the comfort food and fashion options, when asked to respond to the word fountain. Simultaneously, you have disinhibited the watery choices, even outfitting them with the verbal chassis, which you drove into your speech centers, which then allowed you to say them to me. It's a priority thing. In the wacky world of internal filtering, battle axe is defeated by water. Like I said, you can actually measure latent inhibition in the laboratory. If you have high latent inhibition scores, you can block out a lot of the options being offered to you in pursuit of some goal. If you have low latent inhibition scores, you become willing to entertain more and more unusual, potentially irrelevant, certainly uninhibited ideas. It is very possible these data are revealing the internal circuitry of narrow-mindedness and also the intoxicating freedom of choice. There has been a great deal of interest in these filtering systems in the mental health community. Indeed, some researchers say the presence of creativity and the presence of mental illness go hand in hand. Others simply say it's a matter of perspective. As George Carlin once said, those who dance are considered insane by those who can't hear the music. One of my favorite examples of the tension between cognitive disinhibition and latent inhibition occurs in the humor of Mr. Carlin. He could discern patterns in culture, taking disparate ideas nearly out of left field. That's the cognitive disinhibition part. Then selecting something so obvious that its juxtaposed makes hilarious sense. That's the filtering part. His love of oxymorons is a terrific example. He would say things like, new tradition, then screw up his face in a classic puzzling way. Authentic reproduction was another. So was uninvited guest, mutual differences, live recording, and my favorite, Civil War. Mind far afield, producing options, mind filtered, producing comedy. Regardless of whether you're talking about degrees of mental illness or the innovative insights of a legendary comedian, the heart of the matter is that cognitive disinhibition and latent inhibition reside side by side. They are in tension in typically functioning human beings. You don't get creativity without both. I have said a couple of things here worth repeating. Mixing designer fabric up with rotten milk is probably chief. First, I have said that cognitive disinhibition is the ability to hold a lot of disparate things in your head at once. The greater your capacity and willingness to entertain disparate options, the more creative, potentially problem-solving resources you have at your disposal. Second, I have said that keeping creativity intelligible requires filtering systems which select some options and inhibit others. This is latent inhibition. How do these ideas in tension relate to fluid intelligence? Where they may find common ground lies at the intersection of creativity and, believe it or not, a memory system. That memory system is working memory, the short-term gadget we described last lecture. I told you then that I would provide some more detail about working memory in a later lecture, and that time is now. Let us turn to part 3 of this lecture. Working memory is temporary storage, whereas long-term memory is permanent. Though they reside in one brain, they are separate systems. How do we know this? The beginning of our knowledge of this separation was given to us in one large event, coming from what may be the most famous accident of surgery that exists in the brain sciences. You can't talk about working memory in any meaningful form without discussing this surgery. The guy it happened to is Henry Molaison, referred to during his lifetime as HM. It's to him and his famous surgery I will turn to provide and introduce greater detail about working memory and its relationship to fluid intelligence. Henry Molaison had epilepsy. It became severe enough that in 1953, his doctor suggested he have parts of his brain removed. Now, that's not all that unusual. Then, as now, brain resectioning, that's the formal term for cutting out parts of your brain, has saved the lives of countless people with epilepsy. The doctors elected to remove some of the regions involved in memory. They removed most of the hippocampus and a few nearby areas. When Henry woke up, his epilepsy was gone. Unfortunately, so was his memory, a very specific part of his memory. He could no longer transit the border crossing between short-term and long-term memory. He could read a page in a book, then read it again and again, with no ability to remember he had just read it. He could meet someone for the first time hundreds of times a day. That's because he had no capacity to recall the meeting. On average, he could hold new information for only about 30 seconds, and then it would fade. One of the most uniquely tragic consequences of this perpetual Groundhog Day was related by researcher Suzanne Corkin in her book, Permanent Present Tense. Henry would sometimes inquire of his uncle's health with no recollection the man had been dead for years. Each time he was informed of the death, he broke down in grief. His sadness was fresh to him and would be fresh to him for the rest of his life. We brain scientists regularly mention HM research because it produces two insights. First, it dramatically illustrates the division of the memory systems into short-term and long-term forms. Second, we have a handle on some of the neurological underpinnings mediating these systems because of the surgery. The hippocampus, the region HM mostly lacked, is profoundly involved in the conversion of short-term to long-term memory traces. Interestingly enough, some of Henry Molaison's non-declarative memory processing was still available after surgery. You could teach him how to do certain motor learning tasks, like tapping tasks, and he would remember how to do it forever. He just had no idea that he had learned it. This is another great example of the subdivisions of memory systems within the human brain existing. What does this have to do with creativity or fluid intelligence? A great deal, actually. But to understand its relevance, we have to examine the concept of working memory in greater detail. The notion of working memory is most closely associated with a lively British scientist, Alan Baddeley, who first theorized its existence and looks for all the world like Clarence Oddbody in the movie It's a Wonderful Life. He's the researcher who's done the most to characterize its many facets. Alan Baddeley conceived of working memory as a temporary workspace like a desktop with lots of items on it. I'm going to discuss my favorite Looney Tunes cartoon rather than a late 1946 Jimmy Stewart film or a British scientist to talk about those items. You can chalk that up to my own cognitive disinhibition tendencies. This will hopefully help us give a glimpse of Baddeley's multifaceted ideas. The episode is called What's Opera Doc? Released in 1957, directed by the legendary animator Chuck Jones. The episode starred Bugs Bunny et al. And featured the music of Richard Wagner, probably in a way that would have given him stomach acid. It's an hysterically funny, wonderfully whimsical satire on Wagnerian opera and contemporary ballet, quoting liberally from Die Walküre, Tannhäuser, and 1940s slapstick. Director Chuck Jones did not create What's Opera Doc alone, of course. He depended on many people to flesh out his vision, and it is the team with whom he worked that is the source of my illustration for dealing with working memory. Chuck needed to start with a scriptwriter. All animations do, one who could put words in the mouths of the characters to be drawn. He needed visual artists to animate those characters, then other visual artists to do the backgrounds and the layouts. Finally, he needed an executive supervisor to coordinate all of this activity. Since he was the director, that activity fell to him. Add composers, musicians, and editors, and out pops a What's Opera Doc? Looney Tunes! It is considered by professional animators to be #1 in the list of the 50 greatest cartoons of all time. Believe it or not, Alan Badley's conception of working memory reminds me of Chuck Jones and his talented team, and I'd like to show you why. As we discussed, working memory is a temporary storage space in your brain. Its job is to bring information into your conscious awareness, then hold it for a short period of time, usually to support some activity you have chosen to engage. For example, you use working memory when you decide to call someone, inserting the phone number into working memory while you punch in the number. You also use it when you are reading, holding pieces of previously exposed text in a temporary buffer while you take in the new stuff. You use it when you're drawing things or remembering an artistic work someone else drew. You employ it when I ask you to think of a word associated with fountain and you come up with water splash and Duchamp. You retrieved the information, storing those choices in this workspace. Working memory has a number of complicated associated subsystems, according to Alan Badley, and this is where our Looney Tunes analogy comes into play. Working memory is a lot like the Warner Brothers studio Chuck Jones used to create What's Opera Doc. There is a subsystem within working memory that mainly processes verbal information. For example, you can think of it as the guy in the studio who writes the script for What's Opera Doc. Alan Badley calls this verbal guy the phonological loop neurons of working memory. The phonological loop neural circuits process any information that is both auditory and verbal. They are functionally divided into two groups: a temporary storage buffer for the information itself, and, as would be necessary to keep it as a memory gadget, a retrieval component. There is another subsystem within working memory that mainly processes visual information, which you can think of as the artists and animators who draw the characters and backgrounds for What's Opera Doc. Alan Badley calls these guys the visual spatial sketchpad neurons of working memory. These neurons are distinguished from the phonological loop by a very easy criterion. They don't process information that comes into our ears. They process information that comes into our eyes. Visual spatial circuits are also divided into two subcomponents. There's an object memory store, which mostly processes color and shape. There's a spatial store also, a separate function for processing motion and the spatial distribution of those objects. Finally, there is a subsystem in the brain that supervises the work of the scriptwriter and the animator. This would be the director of What's Opera Doc, Chuck Jones in our metaphor. Alan Badley calls this supervisor the central executive, appropriately enough. All these, the phonological loop, visual sketchpad, and central executive, work together in a coordinated fashion to help you read text, see objects, and generally get along in life. There are some other subsystems also involved in Alan's ideas. Like I said, it's a complex notion, but that's enough for us to return to our ideas of fluid intelligence, which we are about to do. Some researchers believe working memory, that amazing head-bound animation studio of yours, can directly affect fluid intelligence abilities, and for a simple reason. It determines the number of temporary variables you can hold in your head simultaneously. The bigger your capacity, the more you can hold. This is a skill you need if you're going to attempt to pattern match, or to problem solve, or do abstract reasoning, or use any of the cognitive gadgets that characterize fluid intelligence. Cattell and Horn believe that the many skills involved in fluid intelligence need a fairly robust desktop to function adequately. It's the same space you need to be creative. Here we see a common theme. The ideas of Cattell and Horn both require memory processing. They say that crystallized intelligence involves long-term memory systems. Fluid intelligence involves short-term memory systems. The presence of both short and long-term memory is another terrific way to show that memory is not a unified concept. The concept is mature enough that we even know some of the neurological systems involved in each. We need it both to survive in the unfashionable, unstable world of the Serengeti. We now turn to the practical application section of this lecture. We will focus on improvement. Are there any exercises you can do which can improve fluid intelligence or cognitive disinhibition skills, or simply make you more creative? There is both bad news and good news. The bad news is that no randomized, blinded, placebo-controlled trials exist showing that a specific exercise can improve creativity ingredients such as native cognitive disinhibition skills. The good news is that we are not clueless about things to try. These data suggest a number of exercises that are at least worth taking out for a test drive. Perhaps someday we will know if they are truly effective. Here's the 3-step exercise based on a suggestion from neuroscientist Seth Horowitz in his book, The Universal Sense. Page 104, and from which I freely quote. Seth is going to ask you to wash your hands and pay attention to the sounds you make. This will take you about 5 minutes to complete. Step number 1, washing your hands. The first step involves imagining that you are about to wash your hands. Seth would like you to think about the sounds you will make. Perhaps you will imagine the sounds of water gushing out of the faucet, then going down the drain. Maybe some splashing sounds. Done. But that is hardly the only sound that will occur, and the idea Seth is proposing here is to find out if you can expand your projections. He says to notice the sounds you would make walking on a floor of some kind. Wood? Rug? Tile? What is on your foot? Sandals? Tennis shoes? Pumps? That will change the sounds of the wood, rug, tile interaction. When you reach for the faucet, Seth reminds us that the clothes you are wearing will gently scrape against your skin. Also a sound. Did you hear it? The faucet you turn will make a sound. Is it a squeaky metal-on-metal noise? How about the sound of the water being released from the faucet before it hits the sink? Isn't that a sound too? Now the water is gushing out of the faucet, splashing against the sink, vortexing down the drain, the sounds you may have imagined in the first place. But that was never your only option. You have many others to consider before hearing it. Now, get up and do it for real. Go wash your hands. Pay attention to the sounds you had previously imagined as you actually do this exercise physically, then proceed to step number 2. Step number 2, reimagining. Now go back to your chair. Do Seth's imaginary exercise again, only this time, don't just think of splashing water. Expand the options you are willing to consider, going beyond the ones mentioned here, imagining as many sounds as you can. Then, when you're finished, march back to the washroom, once again paying close attention to the sounds you were just imagining. Doing it in your head tucks this exercise squarely into your psychological interiors, the lair of your naturally occurring cognitive disinhibition talents. Step number 3, Repeat as needed and with other senses. Try practicing this expansion awareness on a routine basis. You can do this with colors during a walk. You can do this with tastes or smells when sitting at a restaurant. Tactile sensations during a massage. Follow the same pattern. Imagine the sensations first and then do it for real. Getting in this habit increases your awareness of the options available to you. Does it improve cognitive disinhibition? We have no idea. The exercise is based on the idea that one obvious characteristic of people who score high on cognitive disinhibition tests is the awareness that other options exist for problem solving. Since awareness is key, the first step towards boosting cognitive disinhibition may involve improving your sensory attentiveness. With a brief review of both crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence, we have now ended our discussion about the things that make us smart. These are hardly the only models out there attempting to describe human intelligence. As we may have related earlier, it may not even be the best. Cattell and Horn first proposed their ideas many decades ago, a bit long in the tooth, and there have been many other models proposed since. So, where do we go from here? We've been dwelling for some time on the structure of human intelligence. We've been discussing crystallized and fluid intelligence as a way to organize the cognitive machinery behind the brain's considerable information processing gifts. We now have enough information to change course, which is what's going to happen in the next lecture. We're going to move from structure to function. The brain continually uses all this previously described machinery to do something. In this case, it's to process the raw information supplied to it by our 5 senses. The goal is still survival, which should now be as familiar as it is simple. That will be the only thing that's simple. Our next stop in this journey, the senses, might feel like a winding river. It will take us on many surprising twists and turns. My guess is you're used to this by now. It will be as inexplicable as words like plosity and privatenalia, and as magical as being able to turn milk into silk.